Hello, and welcome back to the Security Metrics podcast. My name is Jen Stone. I'm one of the principal security analysts here at Security Metrics. Today, we're going to talk about mobile device management. It's a pretty heavy lift. If you're part of that group that is responsible for keeping mobile devices secure, you're going to know what I mean. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a pretty interesting topic. Security teams recognize that the risks posed by laptops, tablets, smartphones, and other mobile devices, especially because of our increasingly remote working environment and the ongoing challenges posed by the use of personal devices for work. Today, I'm happy to be able to talk to Mike McNeil about the state of mobile device management and understand solutions out there that can be used to secure those devices. Mike, tell us a little bit about yourselves. Give us a little intro. I don't have a bio for you.
Yeah. My LinkedIn, it's not purposely cagey, but it's a little vague in the description.
I liked it. It was very man of mystery. But you are the founder and CEO of Fleet DM.
I am.
And Fleet DM is a mobile device management solution. So before we even talked about that, and of course there are a lot of solutions out there. So I don't want people to feel like, hey, we're only talking about your solution. We're going to try and keep it high level and keep it focused on how do people keep mobile devices secure. But I really like the solution that you do have, and I was really excited to get to talk to you specifically about it, because if anybody's in the development sphere, you probably have heard of Mike. He's the sales guy, sales.js with an AI, not an ALE. Right, so there are a lot of YouTube videos out there that Mike is in, and I think that you're going to like to hear from him. So before we talk about how to keep them secure, a lot of people are probably wondering, what are mobile devices? What falls under that category?
Yeah, and so MDM, or mobile device management, is one of these terms that kind of has evolved a little bit over the years, and people have gotten this idea of it as really like three main things: patching software on usually laptop computers, and then to some degree on phones, although there's less power there. The ability to lock down OS config on laptop computers, and the ability to get laptops drop shipped pre-enrolled for those other capabilities with a program like DEP for Macs or Autopilot for Windows.
Right. And so people might be saying, well, how is this any different from workstation security? Like, why is there a whole separate category for mobile device management?
Yeah, so like looking back at the history of where that word came from, it's part of it was phones, and like I remember hearing the buzzword like enterprise mobility back. I think I worked on my first MDM project was like 2013, and I was working with this telecommunications company, and we were actually just building sales demos of like iPad apps to like show like, so this is how you can control your Wi-Fi router from I don't know, another country, and you can like help your kids turn off and on their Wi-Fi on their cell phones. So I think the vision was originally like, look, laptops and devices are just generally becoming more pick it up and take it with you.
Yeah.
And you can't really rely on like the network as much anymore. Now that said, like MDM these days, and what I'll mainly focus on, because where my expertise is and I'm learning, right? But it's around the laptop use case. And Fleet, just to make this clear, didn't start as a device. It's always been a device management company, but it really didn't start as a project focused on laptops at all. It was really focused on servers and just any kind of computing device. So one big difference between a traditional MDM and maybe a tool like Fleet is that Fleet is really like a read-only visibility tool that is part of your device management strategy. So you would still use Fleet with like an MDM like Jamf or Kanji, but at least today. But Fleet's going to give you like visibility about like, what software do I have installed on these computers? Can I like collect telemetry from these computers and send it to my SIEM or my data platform like Snowflake? And then Fleet's also going to give you visibility into vulnerabilities. Like, is there anything in NVD about this piece of software? Is there a known exploited vulnerability on this piece of software? That kind of thing.
And so from my perspective, what I saw, especially in the last 2 years, was everybody started working from home because people weren't even going into the office, right? So it used to be not even that long ago that a lot of organizations didn't allow people to take work mobile devices, laptops, phones, whatever computing device they had to use. They didn't even let them take them out of the network. For I think the reason that you're talking about, people relied on network security for these devices, and then they're like, well, don't take it off the network because then we lose all this security, right? Everybody kind of had to shift over the last couple of years and figure out how do we keep that secure. And it's been a much heavier lift for some groups than others. Like there are groups that were already ready. They already had remote work policies and procedures in place. They already had tools in place to let them know what was patched, what was not patched. But there are a lot that still don't, or that have struggled to get the insight that they needed. And so when your survey came across my desk, I thought this is really interesting. It seems like you're seeing a lot of devices that are mobile devices that are used outside of the network, like increasingly. Is that what the survey showed? What you're seeing on your end?
Yeah, and we mostly focused on the laptop use case again, just because that's the part that works best with OS Security, which is kind of the world that I live in mostly these days. But just speaking for workstations, right, for laptops, if you have a remote workforce, which pretty much everybody has some portion of the workforce remote, like you're either relying on the VPN for everything, and you're probably having a harder and harder time of it. Mm-hmm. Or you're enabling some kind of, dare I say it, zero trust approach where you're really trying,
Hopefully, and that's one of the recommendations that you actually give, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But so, how are you seeing, as you're talking to organizations, how do you think people are doing with their efforts to secure these laptops? What's the general sense out there of how secure, the insight, where people are at compared to where they should be in terms of that security?
Yeah. So it starts off with this, if we rewind and we just imagine ourselves in the past where like everything's under network security, and at least in theory, right? Yeah. It starts off with that one team. They set up like maybe the marketing team wanted to get security to get them access to a new product, but they ended up just kind of like rolling it out, and it's just some shadow IT, like who knows what. Yeah. So everybody's little, moles started popping up all across the organization.
That's not an unusual story either. Like this is not like I hear that about that all the time. Somebody wanted to do something that somebody wouldn't let them do, so they set it up themselves.
Yeah, which I mean, it's the spirit of it's a hacker spirit, right? Like we find things that need to get done, and we get it done, whether that's the sales gal or the gal working in the software engineering department. So we start off with those kind of little shadow IT things. Actually, I heard a story. A friend of mine worked at a very large company, and they had a problem where there was all these cloud accounts with a cloud provider getting set up, and I think it was like a 2-year process that they were still working through in their procurement department to like round up these different cloud accounts, and with no end in sight, right? Like if your only choices are negotiate and also coordinate an enterprise-wide agreement, that slows things down. And it's at a certain point, if you have people that are empowered and you let people kind of spend company money like it's their own money, at least on a departmental level, eventually they'll just solve the problem themselves.
So from kind of a centralized point of view, enrollment is a problem. How do you get so you're seeing really slow enrollment where people are doing it. Once these devices are enrolled, what kind of effectiveness are they in terms of getting the information to the teams that they need to see out of all these devices?
So in terms of enrollment, it can be a challenge, right? So just especially software engineers, we don't like the idea that like there's some opaque code running on our machine monitoring who knows what about our laptops.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of other people in other roles would probably feel the same way if they were thinking about it as much as engineers, have been trained to think about that. And so you get resistance, right? And people being like, well, why do we have to do this? I don't understand. And
right.
You hopefully have a good process in place and you communicate. It's compliance, it's security posture, it's consistency, making sure that we actually know where the laptops are, so we're not just like losing them all the time, or trying to like send 2 copies of the same laptop to somebody. But that's all really intangible, and especially in these huge organizations, it can be even in a 1,000-person organization, that's still a lot of folks and a lot of feedback to kind of manage.
Yeah.
So there's actually a really cool project from, I think, Shopify, and they did this is back when Jamf was called Casper, and they built this Rails app, right? That would just sit there, and it would actually give every employee of Shopify the ability to see what is being monitored about me and like what are all the queries that have been running on my computer.
Oh, interesting.
And I forget the exact number, but they cranked enrollment significantly. I think they went from like 50% enrollment to something like 80%.
Just because people understood what was being seen and the visibility, rather than a big old, hey, you have to do this, and I'm not telling you why or what we're taking.
Right.
So that's really interesting. So I mentioned the survey, but I didn't tell people you can find it on your website. It's on fleetdm.com. And when I went to go find it, it's just a link at the top of the page, and you just click on it, and you can see it's a really comprehensive survey for people who want to kind of dig more into it and see what's actually going on. And there's a ton of useful information, interesting information. But the part that I thought was the coolest was you have to just keep scrolling and scrolling, because at the very end, you give recommendations. And these recommendations I thought were actually the gold of this. I don't even know how closely they're related to the survey. I don't care. I thought they were really good recommendations on managing on MDM topics. And like you said earlier, Zero Trust. We had last season, we had Jeffrey Sanders come on. He's from CERT at Carnegie Mellon, and he talked about the basics of Zero Trust, the Zero Trust principles. But from a high level, how does Zero Trust, like you said, we're not on the network anymore. So how does that relate, and how does Zero Trust apply to MDM?
So when it comes to Zero Trust, when people hear that word these days in a conversation, I think usually they're thinking of how can we take like the basics that we've already nailed down, right? Like we have some kind of SSO, we have some to prevent password issues, we have some kind of like 2FA, probably, at least on most of our apps, and ideally it's like a YubiKey. We're not usually there yet, but there's some kind of 2FA there, right? So assuming the basics are done, I think people are really more interested in like device attestation, or this BeyondCorp idea from Google, where it's not just who you are, or in that you have the credentials to be able to access the whatever you're trying to access, but that we also know like what machine you're on, like what actual device you're on, and that is being used to authenticate you as well.
Right. So not only are you authorized to access information, you're authorized to access it from a specific device, right?
Exactly.
And that's a piece that some organizations are starting to really take in stride, and other organizations are kind of probably just hearing about it. As you're listening, if you're like, I've never heard of this is new to me, that's totally okay. So it's basically the things that we're talking about are, can you log into something? And if you can log into something, is there another second factor, two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication that's required in order for you to do this? And then also, can you identify the device, and is it allowed to connect? So there's a lot of ways that you can kind of confirm that your device is allowed to connect to sensitive information, and that's really what it comes down to, because you don't want just anybody anywhere getting to information. And if all you have to protect that information is just a username and password, you're just not protecting that information, right?
Totally. And it's like where where you are, that part we let that constant turn into a variable, right? Like you can be in Starbucks now. You can maybe be in China now, depending on what you're trying to access. And that ends, so it does kind of play a role sometimes, right? If it's depending on the security restrictions or the compliance restrictions. But it's also, I mean, it's also like, hey, is this a recognized device? But does this recognized device have any vulnerable Chrome extensions? Does it meet our security posture? Does it have an unencrypted hard disk even? I mean, like that's unlikely, it's unlikely that you would use that particular mix, but depending on what you're trying to access, it might even vary on a per app basis, what you want to check.
Right. And it definitely varies on a per role basis. What is a person supposed to be doing and how are they supposed to be doing it? Being able to centrally manage that, like you said, and sometimes it's a security issue, but sometimes it really is a compliance issue. You have to be able to prove that you're keeping an eye on all the things that you're keeping an eye on when a person has access to information. So the next one that I thought was you made some pretty strong statements about Linux. Like, if they're using Linux, tell me about that.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of visibility on Linux, OS Query is actually really good. So the good news is there's like a free open source utility out there that's been around since 2015, gotten really stable. And if you have your instrumentation set up to be able to use that data, which you can with Fleet, by the way, then you're in great shape on the visibility side. Not a super common solution. We know like organizations like Comcast, Erin Palmer there has a great video where she talks about kind of what challenges they've had with Linux visibility and how they ended up solving it with OS Query. But in terms of management on Linux, like being able to install software, there's not just like, you don't just go buy Jamf and like plug that in. Linux is kind of the Wild West when it comes to actual workstations.
Right.
But there's always that 1-2% of folks that really want to use Linux. And a lot of organizations really want to let them. It's just sometimes they can't because there's not as much power there in terms of patching and management.
Right. Because really what it comes down to is if you can't manage a system, if you can't patch, if you don't know its current state and ensure that it's actually running against what you want it to run against, then really it shouldn't be part of the mix. Right. So... all right. The next one, a recommendation you made was regarding containers. So first of all, how are containers related to device management? Because we were talking about laptops, but now we're talking about containers. So help me cross that divide.
Yeah, so that's one that, we have a unique perspective at Fleet because we started it, as an open source project for community that's been around since 2017 or so. And there are folks using Fleet for workstations, and there's also folks using Fleet for servers. And if you're using Fleet for servers, like maybe you have a bunch of AWS instances, but you might also just have a bunch of containers floating around, and they might be super ephemeral, right? They may only last for an hour.
Right.
And I think a lot of practitioners really have gotten used to relying on the idea that, look, it's ephemeral. I'm going to trust that it hasn't been modified and that there's no way that it could have been modified from the time it went from image to reified real world living container. And there's starting to be, I think, some organizations that are like, that sounds good, but should we check?
Yeah.
Just to be sure. So the cool thing about, containers is they have a little OS on there. So anywhere you can run Linux, you can run OS Query. So we've seen folks actually enrolling containers as well, just to get the visibility on the runtime state, and to make sure that nothing has changed, and also that the image that they expected to deploy actually deployed.
So really, we're talking about a compute environment, whether it's a laptop, whether it's a container, whether it's a server. A compute environment is something that Fleet wants to take a look at and make sure that it's running in the way that you want it to be running.
Exactly.
This episode is brought to you by Security Metrics Shopping Cart Monitor Inspect. It's a revolutionary new product that can help you detect any problems with your shopping cart security, allowing you to effectively improve your e-commerce security. here's what I know about it. A lot of times people say, well, hey, I am PCI compliant because I passed my SAQA. Great. You're missing most of the things that people are actually stealing information from right now. Shopping Cart Monitor was created to actually close those gaps and help you against things like Magecart and other known e-commerce issues. To learn more about this Shopping Cart Monitor, head to our website, securitymetrics.com. Windows. So most of the time when I go look at different environments, if they have Windows, they're using group policy. So we pull up GPO and review GPO, and you don't necessarily recommend group policy as maybe the primary way to manage Windows systems. What's your viewpoint on that?
So I was talking to someone the other day that had come out of the oil and gas world, and he was talking about GPOs. And part of it is just the connection with traditional network tech. If you're using GPOs, there's a good chance that you're also using other network level solutions.
Yeah.
And you're liable to kind of trip over yourself there as you move to remote work and zero trust. We're seeing a lot of folks get to that point where they're like, okay, maybe it's time. We've seen startups, later stage startups that are all of our Macs are in an MDM, but our Windows devices are still sort of in BigFix and using GPOs. And it's kind of like the last thing to go.
Right.
Microsoft's done a great job with Intune. Their MDM and Defender I've heard great things about as well.
Yeah.
So there's options out there to make the switch. The trouble with that is once you end up with two different MDMs, one for Mac and one for Windows and a different ad hoc solution for Linux, now you got a security team trying to pull data from three different systems just to get baseline visibility into your fleet of workstations.
It feels like you almost have to add headcount in order to manage these different environments with different views into the environment. And so just in the real world, that's one of the things challenges that I'm seeing people run into. But also the entire, so I'm not saying Windows is a bad product. I actually really like Windows. But I also see the old kind of philosophy on how you set up and use a Windows environment with the on-prem, the GPO, the network-based, all of those things that rely on maybe 90s thinking are less and less supportive of how we work today. And so maybe looking at how you pull Windows into a more zero trust, basically, based approach, which I think Fleet really supports, could be more useful to organizations that are trying to streamline or get a single, what's the word, the single pane of glass into how things are running in their environment. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, totally. It's, there's very few organizations that have successfully gone full Mac, for every single thing. At the end of the day, you end up at least with one Windows test laptop for some use case that one of your engineers is working on.
Right.
And even if you're a full Windows environment, it's even more likely that you've probably had some, I'll pick on engineers again, that wanted Macs or that wanted a Linux laptop. So with that kind of world, there are device management solutions that are cross-platform out there. VMware has one, Fleet has one, and I think they're going to become more and more common. A solution, Jump Cloud is another example of which you can use. And with Fleet, we're focused on solving that problem as cleanly and simply and in a developer-friendly way as possible, and keeping it 100% open source.
So I want to talk a little bit more about open source in a minute, but first I want to touch on APIs. A lot of organizations, especially if they're not engineer heavy, struggle with how the APIs fit into the larger scheme of security and management.
Yeah, so it's weird. We're at this spot where there's kind of this changing. We have a customer, right, at a Fortune 1000 networking company, and the team, they lost a couple of people from their team, and they brought on some new security engineers. And one of their new security engineers is basically just out of college, computer science graduate, someone who would have been a normal software engineer, right? Just working on apps in the past, and now getting slotted right into security. College is teaching more security content, right, in the curriculum. And these folks are coming in with a lot more coding skills than, and they're a lot more like kind of developers than security people, stereotypically were in the past. So suddenly you got people that they got a lot of energy, they've got a lot of coding skills, and they're starting to look around at these kind of stuffy old vendor apps out there, and they're kind of wondering, like, maybe we just like build it ourselves or like hook on top of something open source. And then if we need to like get more data, we'll just pull it from the API. And if we want to like set up some alerts, like maybe we'll just like set up some webhooks, or maybe we'll use a little bit of like low code or no code, something like Tines, to be able to trigger whenever a relevant event happens, and then run some custom logic.
We just had Thomas Kinsella from Tines on a recent episode, so very cool that you would mention that. Open source is something that maybe a lot of my listeners are not as familiar with. Can you give me a rundown on basically what is open source and why is it cool?
Yeah, so there was, I think, I forget the year, like the 70s maybe. I'm probably going too far back in the past. There was this guy, Stallman, right, who was in a computer lab, and he had these kind of crappy printers, and he would just sort of like keep banging on the printer and it wouldn't work. And he was like a real technical guy, like, and big fluffy neck beard, right? And he's like, how can I fix these printers? And he looks and he sees that the software is closed source and he can't get the software. So he's like, tell you what, like, how about I just like build everything that anybody ever wanted as open source and just like release it for free.
Because he was so mad at these printers.
Yeah, like a lot of things, right? Like you get mad at something and it turns into creative energy.
Yes.
So he, anyways, long story short, there's actually, I'll give you the link. There's a video by one of the guys behind Bootstrap. His screen name is Fat, who created Twitter Bootstrap. The HTML, CSS kind of styling layout framework.
Yeah, for sure.
And he's called like, "What is open source and why am I so guilty?" And I just kind of paraphrased his talk just now. He does a way better job of like going through, and he like has these hand drawn pictures of Richard Stallman that look really awesome.
We'll put the link in the show notes for sure.
Awesome. But the long story short, the open source movement kind of started as like a, hey, like the engineers like know how to do things, like let's just like give people the code so we can just do them and fix them. And then really started catching on over time, like not necessarily the GPL so much, because it has some problems if you're trying to commercialize software. It's like a viral license. If you include a GPL based dependency, it can force your overarching product to also need to be open source, which not everybody is okay with.
Okay.
But the free beer and free speech license, open source, so like the MIT license, the Apache license, the BSD license, have caught on like wildfire in the realm of software engineering as a whole, because you got all these people who are like kind of very similar to the scenario I described before with a security engineer. Just in the past, it's like, hey, I need to build a website, and here I am building a form, right, with validations and little error messages for the 20th time. Why don't I just like copy and paste from some other code that already exists? And if you have the entire world doing that, eventually people realize, hey, let's just like put the code on GitHub and we can all copy and paste together.
That's very cool. Well, it's been really fun talking to you about this today. Before we break, any additional device management kind of wisdom you want to toss at us today, or anything about Fleet or plans that you have in the future? What how do you want to close with this?
Yeah. So, I mean, Fleet today and OS Query is a great solution if you need data from your devices, and you want to collect that data, be able to see what you've got and what you need to do. In the future, we're really interested in continuing to build out device management more in Fleet, and give more functionality. beyond just visibility. So if you're interested in working on that, or if you have this real problem in your life and your job, or if you just find it fun, we welcome you as a contributor. There's a spot you can jump to on our website to join the Slack channel. And we also have a GitHub, of course, that you can pop in and just see all the code. Everything from our handbook and how we do security internally, to the docs, to even the paid features are all source available and in that single repo.
That sounds really interesting. I'm sure that there are people who would love to be part of that. And so I appreciate you sharing that with us. And thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, take care. Thank you for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed it today just as much as I did. Make sure you check out the meeting notes. And if you haven't seen all of our episodes, there's some great ones out there, and I would encourage you to go back. We mentioned Thomas Kinsella today. We mentioned Jeffrey Sanders. There are a lot of really fun episodes out there that I think you'll enjoy. Take care. Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of Security Metrics Podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.